Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And today, we're going to be tackling something I think a lot of people are curious about, especially with the upcoming election, which is the U.S. presidential election process. And to kind of kick things off, get the right to vote. It's like the bedrock of American democracy. It's not actually specifically mentioned in the Constitution. What do you think of that?
It's quite a paradox, isn't it? You have this document that's supposed to be the framework for our government, but doesn't actually explicitly guarantee the right to participate in it.
Yeah, that's kind of blowing my mind a little bit already. So how did they even decide who got to vote,
Okay.
in those early days?
Well, that thorny issue was basically left up to individual states. So what you ended up with was this really crazy quilt of voting rules across the nation. It could really vary wildly depending on where you lived.
So, like, theoretically,
Yeah,
you could have had someone who was eligible to be president, but couldn't even vote for themselves.
absolutely. It sounds unbelievable now. But in the 19th century, a woman or an African American could theoretically meet the qualifications for president, but be denied the vote in their own state.
Wow, that's like a serious disconnect. You're good enough to lead the country, but not good enough to vote in it. How did we even evolve from that kind of system?
Well, over time,
Yeah.
the qualifications for voting kind of shifted. Initially it was all about property ownership, kind of a holdover from colonial times. But as we moved into the 19th century, the focus really changed to what they called intrinsic personal qualifications.
And what does that even mean?
Well, in essence, it boiled down to being a white male adult. It was the era of the, quote, white man's republic, a term that unfortunately reflects the reality of who held power in those days.
And to make things even more complicated, even the definition of whiteness was ambiguous.
Right, and the Supreme Court even got involved, basically defining whiteness based on common perception,
Right.
which, as you can imagine, set the stage for a lot of racial inequalities down the line.
It's amazing how these early decisions can have such long-lasting consequences. And to think that some states even allowed non-citizens to vote back then.
Yes, that's often overlooked. It challenges this assumption that voting has always been restricted to citizens. The historical reality is far more nuanced.
It seems like voting rights in America have always been this kind of tug of war. But the Constitution itself does address voting in some ways right. I mean, we have the 15th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments.
Yes, those amendments were really crucial in shaping voting rights. But they all share a rather interesting characteristic. They're all framed in the negative, focusing on what states cannot do, rather than granting specific rights.
So it's more about setting boundaries than
Right.
providing guarantees.
Exactly, and that vagueness, especially in the 15th Amendment, really opened the door for a century of voter suppression tactics.
Yeah, the 15th Amendment. That was supposed to protect the voting rights of newly freed slaves after the Civil War, right? But it sounds like it didn't quite live up to its promise.
The intention was there, but the wording left a lot of wiggle room for states to find creative ways to disenfranchise black voters.
So we're talking about things like poll taxes, literacy tests, and that infamous white primary. Practices that were specifically designed to keep black people from voting.
That's right. And I think it's important to connect these historical examples to the term voter suppression that we use today. The tactics may have evolved, but the underlying goal remains the same: to make it harder for certain groups to vote.
It's kind of a sobering reminder that progress isn't always linear. But thankfully, we did see some victories along the way, like the 24th Amendment, which finally outlawed poll taxes in 1964. It's crazy to think that something so blatantly discriminatory was allowed for so long.
It does seem incredible now, doesn't it? But I think it speaks to the persistence required to achieve change and the importance of understanding the long history of the fight for voting rights.
And speaking of the fight for voting rights, the 1960s were such a pivotal decade. I mean, you had the Civil Rights Movement really gaining momentum, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 kind of laying the groundwork. It really felt like the whole country was on the verge of this major shift.
Oh, absolutely. It was a time of incredible social and political upheaval. And the fight for voting rights was right at the heart of it. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a monumental achievement, finally ensuring the effective right to vote for minorities who had been systematically disenfranchised for generations.
So it wasn't just about having the technical right to vote on paper, but making sure that those votes actually had power.
Exactly. The Voting Rights Act went after these really insidious practices that were specifically designed to dilute the voting power of minorities. Things like racial gerrymandering, where, district lines were drawn to minimize minority representation, and at-large elections,
Yeah.
which often resulted in the exclusion of minority candidates.
For those of us who might not be familiar, can you kind of explain what at-large elections are?
Sure, so at-large elections are where, instead of voting for a representative from your specific district, everyone in a city or county votes for all the representatives. So if a particular racial group is a minority in that area, they might find it very difficult to elect someone who represents their interests. The Voting Rights Act sought to change that by promoting more equitable representation.
So it sounds like they were trying to really level the playing field and make sure that every vote truly carried equal weight.
That was the goal, and Sections 2 and 5 of the Act were really instrumental in achieving that. Section 2 allowed for legal challenges against discriminatory voting practices, while Section 5 required states with a history of disenfranchisement to actually get pre-clearance from the federal government before making any changes to their voting laws.
So it was kind of like putting those states on probation, like we're watching you.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And that oversight proved incredibly effective for decades. But in a controversial 2013 decision, the Supreme Court actually struck down Section 5, arguing that it was no longer necessary.
And hasn't that unfortunately paved the way for kind of a resurgence of voter suppression efforts, even if the tactics are a little more veiled these days?
Yeah, it's definitely a valid concern. The fight for voting rights is far from over. But maybe we can take a step back for a moment and explore another really significant chapter in this whole story, which is the fight for women's suffrage.
It's honestly mind-boggling to think that women had to fight for so long to gain such a fundamental right.
It really is. The journey to women's suffrage was a long and arduous one, starting well before the Civil War.
We often hear about the 19th Amendment, but wasn't there a lot that happened before that?
Oh, absolutely. The 19th Amendment was really the culmination of decades of activism. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 is widely considered a pivotal moment in the women's suffrage movement. But initially, the fight was focused on winning voting rights at the state level, rather than through a constitutional amendment.
So it was kind of this state-by-state battle. I imagine that must have been a really slow and frustrating process.
It was women in some states had the right to vote, while others continued to be denied. It must have been incredibly disheartening at times. But the suffragists never gave up, and their dedication eventually led to a national movement for a constitutional amendment.
And then finally in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, granting women the right to vote across the country. But even that victory wasn't without its drama, right? Didn't it come down to a single vote in Tennessee?
It's a remarkable story. One vote in one state determined the fate of women's suffrage nationwide. It really shows you how fragile progress can be. And even after the 19th Amendment, social barriers and deep-seated prejudices continued to hinder women's full participation in politics.
It's a reminder that legal rights don't automatically translate into social change. But the 19th Amendment was a crucial step, setting the stage for the greater political representation of women that we see today.
Indeed, women now make up the majority of voters in the United States, and who knows, we might even see the first female president in 2024.
Now, that would be quite a milestone. But it's important to remember that not everyone was in favor of women's suffrage. There was actually a pretty significant anti-suffrage movement. And get this, it was led by women.
Yeah, it might seem counterintuitive, but there were women who actively opposed giving women the right to vote. They had various reasons, Some believed that women should focus on the domestic sphere. Others feared that suffrage would disrupt the social order.
History is rarely simple, isn't it? And the fight for voting rights continued to evolve. Even after women won the right to vote, take the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18 in 1971.
Ah, yes, the 26th Amendment. Old enough to fight for your country, old enough to vote right. It's a relatively recent change, but one that significantly expanded the electorate and brought a new generation of voters into the fold.
It's interesting to think about how voting practices themselves have transformed over time. I mean, today we take things like secret ballots and voter registration for granted, but that wasn't always the case, was it?
Not at all. Voting in the early days of the Republic was a very different experience. It was often a public affair, with people voicing their choices or using ballots that were produced by political parties, which, didn't exactly guarantee anonymity.
So much for the sanctity of the secret ballot. How did we get from those very public displays to the private voting booths that we use today?
Well, the shift towards secret ballots was partly driven by a desire to reduce the influence of urban political machines. These organizations were notorious for their strong-arm tactics. You're often pressuring or even intimidating voters, especially immigrants and the poor.
So the secret ballot was kind of a way to level the playing field.
Exactly the introduction of the Australian ballot system in the late 19th century, with its emphasis on privacy and uniformity, was a major step forward in ensuring that people could vote freely, without fear of reprisal.
And wasn't the introduction of personal voter registration another significant change?
Yes, that was another major development, also aimed at curbing the power of those political machines. But while it was intended to prevent fraud, it also had the unintended consequence of potentially suppressing voter turnout, especially among those who were already marginalized.
It's kind of a classic example of how seemingly neutral rules can have unintended consequences, particularly when it comes to who gets to participate in the political process. And on that note, let's talk about some of the more recent changes we've seen, like the rise of mail-in voting and early voting. Those seem to be causing quite a stir these days.
They have become rather controversial, haven't they? These methods were designed to make voting more convenient and accessible, but they've also been subject to criticism and even attempts to restrict their use.
It seems like every step forward in expanding voting rights is met with some kind of pushback.
That's often the case. Change is rarely easy, especially when it comes to something as fundamental as who gets to participate in our democracy. And speaking of controversial systems, we can't overlook the elephant in the room, the Electoral College.
Ah, the Electoral College, the system that everyone loves to hate. Why don't we just elect the president by popular vote? Seems like that would be a lot simpler.
Well, the Electoral College is this fascinating relic of the 18th century. It's really a product of compromise and historical context. It was created as a way to balance the interests of large and small states. But it's also deeply intertwined with the legacy of slavery.
And that connection to slavery isn't just some abstract historical footnote, is it?
Not at all. It's woven into the very fabric of the Electoral College through the infamous Three-Fifths Compromise.
Can you remind us what that was all about?
Sure. So the Three-Fifths Compromise, which was adopted during the Constitutional Convention, allowed slave states to count 3/5 of their enslaved population for the purpose of determining representation in Congress and consequently in the Electoral College. This gave Southern states disproportionate power in presidential elections.
It's a stark reminder that the fight for voting rights has always been connected to these broader issues of equality and justice.
Absolutely, the Electoral College, with its historical baggage and its potential to override the popular vote, continues to be a source of debate and controversy.
It's a system that really reflects a very different era, and it's worth considering whether it's still the best way to choose the leader of the most powerful nation on earth. But before we get too deep into that debate, I'm curious about something else. Why do we always vote in November? And why on that specific Tuesday after the first Monday? It seems rather arbitrary.
It does, doesn't it? But like many things in our electoral system, there's a historical explanation. The choice of November dates back to 1845. Remember, the United States was primarily an agricultural society back then. November fell after the harvest, but before the harsh winter weather set in, making it easier for people to travel to the polls.
So we're essentially still operating on a 19th century agricultural calendar when it comes to elections.
It's a curious reminder that even seemingly arbitrary aspects of our electoral system have their roots in history. Speaking of historical quirks, did you know that the secret ballot, something we consider a fundamental aspect of democratic elections, was actually an idea imported from Australia?
That's interesting. I had no idea.
Yeah, the Australian ballot system, with its emphasis on privacy and uniformity, was adopted in the United States in the late 19th century. It was a game changer, really, transforming the way we vote.
It's fascinating how even these long-established practices
Yeah.
can evolve and adapt over time.
It speaks to the dynamic nature of democracy. It's not a static system frozen in time. It's this constantly evolving process, shaped by history, social movements, and the ongoing struggle for greater equality and participation.
I think that's a great place to kind of transition
Yeah.
into the final part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground. From the Constitution's silence on voting rights to the fight for suffrage, the evolution of voting practices, and the enduring controversies of the Electoral College.
It's been quite a journey. Through the twists and turns of American electoral history,
It really feels like this fight for voting rights. It's just woven into the fabric of American history. It's a story that's still unfolding today, right?
absolutely. The fight for voting rights is a living story. It's constantly evolving as we grapple with new challenges and reinterpret those fundamental principles.
And what's so fascinating to me is how the fight for voting rights often intersects with all these broader social and political movements, the civil rights movement, the women's suffrage movement, even the Vietnam War protests, they all play a role in shaping. You know who gets to vote and how we vote.
Yeah, you really hit the nail on the head there. It's like each generation adds its own chapter to this ongoing saga, a story full of complexities and setbacks and hard-won victories.
It makes you realize that the right to vote, it isn't something we can just take for granted. It's something that's been fought for and defended over generations.
Precisely. And as we navigate the complexities of the 21st century, the fight for voting rights. It's undoubtedly going to continue to evolve. We're facing new challenges, like the influence of technology, the changing demographics of the electorate, and the ongoing debate about the best ways to ensure fair and accessible elections.
Speaking of the future, what do you think the next chapter of this story looks like? Could we see a renewed push for electoral college reform?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that's really hard to answer definitively. I mean, there's certainly a growing momentum for electoral college reform, especially after recent elections, where the winner of the popular vote didn't actually become president. And, the increasing diversity of the American electorate, that might add fuel to this movement as well, as groups that have historically been marginalized seek greater political power.
And how do you think technology will shape the future of voting? Will it make voting more accessible or more vulnerable?
Well, technology is kind of a double-edged sword when it comes to voting. On the one hand, it has the potential to make voting more convenient and accessible, especially for people with disabilities, those living overseas, or, those in remote areas. Online voting, for example, could increase participation and make the whole process more efficient. But on the other hand, we have to be really mindful of the security risks. Hacking, misinformation, voter manipulation, these are all serious concerns that need to be addressed if we're going to embrace technology in our elections.
Yeah, a lot to think about. So as we kind of head to the polls in the next election or engage in these discussions about voting rights, what are some key takeaways you'd want to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think the most important thing is to remember that our democracy, it's a work in progress. It's not a spectator sport. It requires active participation, critical thinking, and a willingness to engage in thoughtful debate. Understanding the history of voter rights is absolutely crucial because it gives us context. For the challenges that we face today, we need to be informed citizens. We're aware of the tactics of voter suppression, the ongoing efforts to expand access to the ballot box, and the importance of protecting this fundamental right for absolutely everyone.
Well said. The history of voting rights in America. It's really a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of fighting for what's right, and the belief that our democracy is strongest when everyone has a voice.
It's also a reminder that change is possible, even when the odds seem insurmountable. The fight for voting rights, it's a long and winding road, but it's a journey worth taking.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating and complex world of U.S. elections. We hope it's given you a deeper appreciation for the long and embattled history of voting rights in this country.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to stay curious, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay active in our democracy. Your voice matters, and your vote is your voice.
And remember, the story of voting rights in America, it's still being written. The next chapter is up to all of us.
Right.